My bare feet burned on that auction block. The Arizona sun in 1868 had a special kind of cruelty. It beat down on Tucson's main street, turning the dust to a fine, hot powder that coated my cracked lips. The rope on my wrists was a constant biting reminder of how I got here. 23 years old, stood up like a lame horse nobody wanted. "Step forward, girl," the auctioneer barked. His breath smelled of whiskey and rot, and a gold tooth flashed when he smiled, which was far too often. I shuffled forward, the hem of my worn calico dress snagging on a splinter. It felt like the wood itself was trying to hold me back. The whole sorry morning started with my father's voice, cold and sharp as a winter wind. "Catherine, you've brought nothing but shame to this family. 3 years, and no husband wants a wife who can't give him sons." Ma didn't say a word. She just turned her back, her shoulders shaking as she kneaded bread dough with angry, desperate fists. The decision was already made. Now, strangers pointed at me. Their whispers were like insects buzzing around my head. A big man with tobacco stains on his shirt grabbed my chin. He turned my head left, then right, his thumb digging into my jaw. "She looks healthy enough," he muttered to his friend. "But what good is damaged goods?" The mark he left burned hotter than the sun. "Gentlemen, let's start the bidding at $50, the auctioneer boomed. My heart didn't just sink. It fell through the floor of my chest and into a cold, dark pit. $50. That's what you paid for a broken plow, a mule that was going to die next week. The crowd murmured, but no one moved. No one raised a hand. And that's when I heard it. Slow, steady footsteps. The jingle of spurs, cutting through the noise like a church bell. The crowd parted. Even the auctioneer squinted, looking over my shoulder. A shadow fell over me, and for a second, the burning on my skin eased. I smelled leather and clean soap, a smell so different from the unwashed bodies pressing in around me that it made my head swim. The stranger who cast the shadow didn't push or shove. He just stood there, patient as a stone. "Do I hear 50? The auctioneer tried again, his voice a little shaky now. The silence stretched. It got thick and heavy, like a wool blanket in July. A church bell chimed 10 o'clock. This might be the last time I heard it as Catherine Wells, the last time I was a person instead of property. Just when I thought the silence would break me, a voice cut through the air. It was deep and calm. $200. The words landed like a physical blow. Every single person in that dusty street turned to look, including me. The man stood just behind the platform, his black hat pulled low, casting his face in shadow. His hands rested on his belt, easy and loose. He hadn't shoved his way to the front. He hadn't gawked or pointed. He just waited. The auctioneer, a man who traded in human misery, was completely stunned. "Sir," he stammered, his gold tooth catching the sun. "Did you say 200? He forced a greasy smile. Well, that's mighty generous, for a woman with her particular problem." The stranger stepped into the light then, and I saw him for the first time. He was tall, lean, with skin weathered by the sun and wind. His eyes were the color of sagebrush after a hard rain. His clothes were worn but clean. He looked like a man who owned his own land and wasn't afraid to work it. "I said what I said," he replied, his voice even. He pulled out a leather pouch, and the sound of gold coins clinking together was the most beautiful and terrifying sound I'd ever heard. "Question is, are we going to talk all day, or are we going to finish this business?" Suddenly my father was there, pushing through the crowd. His face was red, his eyes shining with a disgusting mix of excitement and pure greed. "Now hold on there, mister. We ain't heard all the offers yet. Maybe someone else wants to bid higher." He looked around, his eyes begging, but the other ranchers were already backing away, shaking their heads and muttering. They knew they were beat. The stranger didn't even look at my father. He just counted out several heavy gold pieces into his palm, letting the sun flash off them. "Anyone else want to match 200? His voice was quiet, but there was something hard as iron underneath it. It made my father take a step back without even realizing it. The auctioneer's hammer came down with a crack like a breaking bone. Sold to the gentleman in the black hat. My legs almost buckled. The world swam for a second, a blur of dust and sun and staring faces, but I stayed on my feet. The stranger walked up to the platform. He didn't look at me like I was a prize he'd won. He looked at me like I was a person. Up close, I could see the lines around his sage-colored eyes. There was kindness there, but also something else. Something hard and sad. "My name's Daniel McKinnon," he said, and he offered me his hand to help me down. His grip was firm and steady. "And you don't need to be afraid of me." But I was afraid. Not of him. I was afraid of what came next. "Why?" I whispered, my feet finally touching solid ground. "Why would you pay so much for someone like me?" Daniel McKinnon looked at me for a long, silent moment. Then he glanced over at my parents. They were already walking away, my father clutching the pouch of gold like it was his salvation. "Maybe because I know what it's like to be worth more than people think," he said, so quietly I almost didn't hear him. "Come on, let's get you out of this heat." As we walked to his wagon, I dared to look back one last time. Ma had stopped. She stood by their old cart, her hand pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. For just a second, our eyes met across that dusty street, and in her eyes, I saw a regret so deep it looked like it was swallowing her whole. But it was too late. There was no going back. Whatever Daniel McKinnon had planned for me, it had to be better than the life I was leaving. It couldn't possibly be worse, or so I thought. The ride to his ranch was silent. The wagon wheels crunched over gravel, a lonely sound in the vast, empty landscape. The territory stretched out in every direction, beautiful and deadly. Daniel didn't speak, and I didn't ask questions. I just watched the jagged mountains scrape against the bright blue sky. We were about an hour out of Tucson when he suddenly pulled the wagon to a halt. "Get down," he said, his voice low and urgent, "and stay quiet." Before I could ask why, I heard it. The faint sound of hoofbeats coming up fast behind us. More than one horse. Daniel grabbed a rifle from beside his seat. The movement was so smooth and practiced it was clear he'd done it 1,000 times before. He pointed to a cluster of boulders off the side of the road. "Behind there. Now." My heart hammered against my ribs, but I did as he said, scrambling over the rocky ground, my worn dress catching on every sharp edge. I pressed myself against the warm stone, peering through a crack. 3 riders appeared over the rise. They weren't cowboys. They were hard-looking men, with rifles held ready across their saddles. They slowed as they approached the empty wagon. "He was right here," one of them growled. "Where'd he go?" "Can't have gone far," another said, his eyes scanning the landscape. His gaze swept right past my hiding spot. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't see the scuff marks my shoes had made in the dust. Daniel was a ghost. He had vanished. I couldn't see him anywhere. The 3rd rider dismounted, walking slowly around the wagon. He ran a hand over the sacks of flour and beans in the back. "McKinnon!" he shouted, his voice echoing in the still air. "We know you're out here. The boss just wants to talk." The silence that answered him was heavy with threat. Then, a voice came from a place I didn't expect, high up, in the rocks on the other side of the road. It was Daniel. "I'm not much for talking, Jed," Daniel called out. His voice was calm, but it carried a deadly edge. "Especially not with your boss's men." The man named Jed spun around, trying to locate the source of the sound. "Don't be a fool, McKinnon. He made you a fair offer for your land." "My land's not for sale," Daniel replied, "and neither is anything else I own. Now, I suggest you and your friends turn around and ride back to whatever hole you crawled out of, before you get hurt." For a long moment, nobody moved. It was a standoff. The 3 men looked at each other, then up at the rocks where Daniel was hidden. I could see the calculation in their eyes. Was it worth it? Apparently not. Jed spat on the ground. "This ain't over, McKinnon." He swung back onto his horse, and the 3 of them galloped away, kicking up a cloud of angry dust. I stayed hidden until Daniel came and got me. He appeared as silently as he had disappeared. One minute the rocks were empty, the next he was standing there. "You can come out now," he said. My legs were shaking so bad I could barely walk. Who were they? "Men who work for a man who thinks money can buy him anything he wants," Daniel said, his jaw tight. "He wants my ranch. More specifically, the water rights that come with it." He helped me back into the wagon, and we started moving again. The silence was different now. It was filled with the questions I was too scared to ask. This man hadn't just bought a woman at an auction. He had bought himself a soldier for a war he was already fighting. And I was starting to think it was a war he was losing. His ranch was nestled in a small valley, a fortress disguised as a homestead. The house was solid, built of thick adobe and heavy timber, with a clear line of sight in all directions. A creek ran through the property, providing the water that man back on the road was willing to kill for. It was beautiful, and it felt like the most dangerous place on earth. That night, after a simple meal of beans and cornbread that we ate without a word, he finally told me why I was there. "I need you to stand watch," he said, his voice flat. "I can't sleep and guard the place at the same time. I need a second pair of eyes, a second pair of hands on a rifle." He didn't ask me if I could shoot. He just assumed I'd learn. The next morning he led me down a flight of stone steps I hadn't noticed, hidden beneath a rug in the main room. They led to a cellar. But this wasn't for storing preserves. The room was an armory. Rifles lined one wall. Boxes of ammunition were stacked to the ceiling. On a large table in the center, a map of the entire territory was spread out, covered in red marks. My breath caught in my throat. "What is this place?" I whispered. "This is the truth," Daniel said, his voice heavy. He lit a lantern, and the shadows danced across his face, making him look older, harder. 3 years ago, the Apache raids in this valley. They weren't random. They were surgical strikes, hitting specific families, driving people off their land. He pointed to one of the red X's on the map. It was right next to his own property. My wife, Mary, wasn't killed in childbirth like the story says in town. She was murdered. During a raid while I was away helping a neighbor put out a fire. The baby died with her. The truth of it hit me like a physical blow. The quiet, sad man wasn't just a widower. He was a man consumed by vengeance. This wasn't about water rights. This was about blood. "The territorial government is useless," he went on, his hands clenched into fists. "They're spread too thin, or they just don't care. So those of us who are left, we formed our own network. We share information. We coordinate defenses." He paused, and his sage green eyes met mine. The kindness I'd seen before was gone, replaced by cold fire. "And sometimes," he said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper, "sometimes we strike back." Suddenly, I understood the $200. It wasn't a generous price. It was a tactical investment. He hadn't bought a wife, or even a helper. He'd bought a lookout, a sentry, a piece of equipment for his private war. But as I looked at the map, at all those red X's marking dead families and burned-out homes, I noticed something else. A pattern. The raids weren't just clearing land around his ranch. They were forming a perfect clear corridor, a path leading straight from the Mexican border north, towards the new railroad line. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about something much, much bigger. And Daniel McKinnon was standing right in the middle of it. The very next day, my real education began. He took me out at dawn, handed me a rifle that felt heavier than a bag of stones, and pointed at a tin can perched on a fence post 50 yards away. "Hit it," he said. I had shot my father's old musket a few times, hunting rabbits. This was different. This was a weapon of war. I lifted it, sighted down the barrel, and squeezed the trigger. The kick nearly knocked me off my feet, and the bullet kicked up dust a good 10 feet to the left of the can. Daniel didn't say anything. He just reloaded and handed it back to me. Again. For hours I shot. My shoulder ached. My ears rang. The smell of gunpowder filled my nose. I missed, and I missed, and I missed again. I was ready to cry from frustration and shame. "I can't do it," I finally said, my voice shaking. "Can't is a word for people who are already dead," he said, his voice as hard as stone. You just haven't decided to live yet. Shoot again." There was a cruelty in his teaching that scared me. He wasn't just training me, he was trying to break me. To burn away the soft girl who stood on the auction block and forged something else in her place. I hated him for it. But I picked up the rifle again. This time, I didn't think. I just remembered the face of the man who grabbed my chin. The greedy light in my father's eyes. The sound of those riders on the road. I squeezed the trigger. The can flew off the fence post with a satisfying ping. A small, tight smile touched Daniel's lips for a fraction of a second. And then it was gone. "Good," he said. "Now do it again." That evening, we visited the Patterson place. They were our closest neighbors, 5 miles down the creek. Mrs. Patterson was a kind woman with worried eyes. Her husband was a stern, silent man who watched Daniel with open suspicion. While Mrs. Patterson gave me a cup of coffee, Mr. Patterson pulled Daniel aside. Their voices were low, but I could hear the tension in them. "More trouble last night, McKinnon," Patterson said. "Another homestead hit. The Millers. The whole family. Gone." "Apache?" Daniel asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Patterson spat on the ground. "That's the story they'll tell. But I saw the tracks. Shod horses. And they weren't interested in cattle. They took a direct route to the house, did their business, and left. This is about land, Daniel. We all know it." Later, as we were leaving, Mr. Patterson caught my arm. He leaned in close, his eyes darting around nervously. "You be careful, girl," he whispered. "Be careful of him." He nodded toward Daniel. "He's not what he seems. People talk. They say his wife. They say it wasn't a raid at all. They say Daniel's temper got the best of him one day." My blood ran cold. It was a lie. It had to be a lie. A vicious rumor spread by scared people. But the seed of doubt was planted. I was living in the house of a man whose quest for vengeance had consumed him. A man who was training me to kill. A man his own neighbors were afraid of. Who was the real monster in this valley? The raiders who came in the night? Or the man who was so determined to stop them? The scream that ripped through the dawn a week later was high and desperate. It sounded like a wounded animal. I was out of bed in an instant, the rifle in my hands before I was even fully awake. The drills with Daniel had become second nature. React first, think later. Daniel was already at the door, pulling on his boots. "Stay here," he ordered. "Like hell I will," I said, checking the load on my rifle. He gave me a look, a flicker of surprise, maybe even respect. But he didn't argue. We moved out together, keeping low, using the trees along the creek for cover. The screaming had stopped. The silence that replaced it was somehow worse. We found her on the creek bank. She was a young Apache woman, barely older than me. She was kneeling by the water, her hands pressed tight against a bloody wound in her shoulder. Her dark eyes were wide with pain and fury. When she saw us, she didn't try to run. She didn't reach for a weapon. She spoke, in perfect, clear English. "Please," she gasped, her voice strained. "They took my brother. White men. They wore soldier clothes, but they weren't real soldiers. They have him at the old mining camp." Daniel raised his rifle, his face a mask of cold suspicion. An Apache, speaking English, telling a story about fake soldiers. It smelled like a trap from a mile away. But I stepped in front of him. I looked into the woman's eyes. I'd stood on that auction block. I knew what desperation looked like. This was real. "Who took him?" I asked, my voice steady. "Men who pretend to be militia," she said, wincing as a wave of pain washed over her. "But they steal Apache children. They sell them. My brother, he is only 14. Daniel's jaw was a tight, hard line. It could be a setup, Catherine. But I knew it wasn't. There was something in her voice that reminded me of my own mother, watching me being led away. The sound of a family being torn apart by cruelty. "What's your name?" I asked, kneeling beside her. "Ayanna," she whispered. I tore a strip from my petticoat and began to bind her wound. She hissed in pain but didn't pull away. Daniel paced behind me, a caged wolf, his mind at war with his instincts. The law said helping an Apache was treason. His heart, the one he tried so hard to hide, was telling him something different. "The mining camp's been abandoned for years," he said finally, his voice rough. "If someone's using it as a base, that's information the real militia needs." He looked at Ayanna, a grudging respect in his eyes. "First, we get your brother back." Ayanna stared at him, her surprise genuine. "You would help me? Your people? And my people?" "Some things are bigger than war," I said, looking at Daniel. "Protecting children is one of them." The plan we made was reckless. Daniel and I would approach the camp from the north, under the cover of the canyon wall. Ayanna, despite her injury, would circle around to the south. She knew the terrain. She could create a diversion if we needed one. But as we were about to leave, Ayanna grabbed my arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "Wait," she said, her eyes locked on mine. "The man who leads them. He has hair like spun gold, and a long white scar across his left cheek. Have you seen a man like that?" Daniel went completely still. It was like he'd been turned to stone. When he spoke, his voice was so cold it could have frozen the creek solid. "Catherine," he said, not taking his eyes off Ayanna. "Go back to the house, pack extra ammunition." "Daniel?" I asked, a new fear twisting in my gut. "Do you know him?" He turned to me then, and the look in his eyes made me take a step back. The grief, the rage, the vengeance. It was all there, burning like a fire. "That man," he said, his voice a low, terrifying growl. "He's not just a slaver. He was Mary's brother, and he's the one who held the torch that burned my home to the ground." The world tilted on its axis. This wasn't just about revenge on a nameless raider. This was about family. A twisted, hateful family feud that had spilled over and set the whole valley on fire. Mary's own brother had murdered her. And suddenly, Daniel's obsession made a terrible, horrifying kind of sense. The mining camp was tucked into a narrow canyon, a collection of rotting shacks and a collapsed mine shaft. It looked deserted, but the faint smell of wood smoke told us otherwise. We left the horses tied in a grove of cottonwoods and made our way forward on foot, moving from rock to rock like shadows. Daniel moved with a deadly grace that was terrifying to watch. This was his element. He was a hunter, and he was closing in on his prey. We found a high ledge that overlooked the camp. Down below, we could see them. 6 men, lounging around a fire. They wore mismatched pieces of old cavalry uniforms, but their discipline was sloppy. They were mercenaries, not soldiers. And then I saw him, the leader. He had his back to us, but the afternoon sun caught his hair, turning it to brilliant gold. He turned to shout an order at one of his men, and I saw the scar. A pale, ugly line that cut from his temple to his jaw. He was exactly as Ayanna had described him. In a makeshift pen near one of the shacks, 2 boys were huddled together. One was clearly Ayanna's brother, his face a mask of defiant terror. The other was a white boy, no older than 12, his face streaked with tears. They weren't just stealing Apache children. They were stealing anyone they could grab. But that wasn't the worst of it. Tied to a post in the center of the camp was a man. He'd been beaten, badly. His head hung low, and his shirt was soaked in blood. It was Mr. Patterson, my neighbor. The man who had warned me about Daniel. They were torturing him for information. "They must have grabbed him this morning," Daniel whispered, his voice tight with controlled fury. "He must have seen something he shouldn't have." Our simple rescue mission had just become infinitely more complicated. We had to get the boys, and we had to get Patterson out. And we had to do it without getting killed. "Ayanna is in position on the south ridge," Daniel said, pointing. "She'll create a diversion when I give the signal. That will draw most of them away from the camp. You and I will go for the children." "What about Mr. Patterson?" I asked. Daniel's face was grim. "He's too close to the center. We get the boys first. They're the priority." He was being practical. He was being strategic. But it felt cold. Leaving a man to die. Before I could argue, he gave the signal, a perfect imitation of a hawk's cry. An instant later, all hell broke loose on the far side of the camp. A rockslide, small but loud, came crashing down the ridge. It was followed by a series of piercing war cries. Ayanna, making herself sound like 10 warriors. Just as Daniel predicted, 5 of the men, including the leader, grabbed their rifles and ran toward the sound, shouting and cursing. Only one guard was left behind, a young, nervous-looking man who kept glancing over his shoulder. "Now," Daniel hissed. We moved like lightning, down the rocky slope and into the camp. Daniel took out the lone guard with a single brutal blow to the back of the head. The man went down without a sound. I ran to the pen, my knife already in my hand. I sliced through the ropes, holding the gate shut. "Come on," I whispered to the boys. "We're getting you out of here." Ayana's brother grabbed my hand, his eyes wide. The white boy just stared, frozen with fear. Daniel was already at Patterson's side, cutting his ropes. Our neighbor was barely conscious. "Daniel?" Patterson rasped, his voice a broken whisper. "The ledger? In the main shack. You have to get it." "What ledger?" Daniel demanded, trying to haul him to his feet. But it was too late. A shout came from the edge of the camp. The leader with the golden hair was standing there, his rifle raised. He wasn't aiming at Daniel or Patterson. He was aiming at the boys. At me. Everything happened in a flash. Daniel shoved me and the boys to the ground. Patterson, with a last desperate surge of strength, threw himself in front of us. The rifle roared. Patterson jerked backward, a dark stain blossoming on his chest. He collapsed in the dust, his eyes staring sightlessly at the sky. Daniel returned fire, his shot echoing the first. The leader cried out and staggered back, clutching his arm. "Get them out of here, Catherine!" Daniel yelled, laying down covering fire as the other men came running back. "Go! I'll hold them off." I didn't hesitate. I grabbed both boys and dragged them toward the cover of the rocks. Bullets whizzed past our heads, kicking up puffs of dust. Ayana's brother was nimble, but the other boy was clumsy with terror. I practically had to carry him. We made it to the canyon wall and scrambled up the same path we'd used to get down. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I just focused on the feel of the boys' small hands in mine, and the sound of the gunfight raging behind us. We ran until our lungs burned and our legs gave out. We finally collapsed in the grove of cottonwoods where we'd left the horses. Ayana was already there, her face pale, her shoulder bleeding again. She hugged her brother tightly, murmuring his name over and over. We waited. Every minute felt like an hour. The sound of gunshots had faded. There was only the wind in the trees and the frantic beating of my own heart. Was Daniel alive? Was he coming back? Or had I just led him to his death? Just as the sun began to dip below the canyon rim, a figure appeared, stumbling through the twilight. It was Daniel. He was covered in dust and blood, but he was alive. In one hand, he carried his rifle. In the other, he held a worn, leather-bound ledger. He collapsed when he reached us, leaning heavily against a tree. I rushed to his side. He had a nasty gash on his forehead, and his side was bleeding from a shallow bullet graze. "Patterson was right," he said, his voice raspy. He pushed the ledger into my hands. "It's all in here. Everything." I opened it. The pages were filled with neat columns of names, dates, and figures. It was a record of payments. Payments made by a powerful land baron named Marcus Thorne to the man with the scar, whose name I now saw was Caleb Vance. Payments for clearing land. Payments for discouraging settlers. It was the proof we needed. The conspiracy, laid out in black and white. But as I flipped through the pages, my eyes landed on a name that made the world stop. A name I knew all too well. A payment made 3 weeks ago for information regarding vulnerable homesteads. The name in the ledger was my father's. The world went silent. The only sound was the rushing in my own ears. My father. His name was right there, in Caleb Vance's spidery handwriting. A payment of $100 for information. He hadn't just sold me. He'd sold out his neighbors, the Millers, the Pattersons. He had pointed these killers in their direction, to save his own skin. The $100 was probably what the creditors were demanding. He'd traded human lives for a little more time. The shame and anger I'd felt on that auction block was nothing compared to this. This was a betrayal so profound it felt like a physical wound. "Catherine?" Daniel's voice was soft, pulling me back from the brink. He saw the look on my face. He knew. I couldn't speak. I just pointed at the name. He looked at the page, and a deep sigh escaped his lips. He wasn't surprised. Just sad. He closed the book. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice regaining its hard edge. "They'll be regrouping." We helped each other onto the horses. I took the younger boy with me, his small body trembling against my back. Daniel rode with Ayana's brother. Ayana, despite her wound, insisted on riding her own horse. She was tougher than any man I'd ever met. We rode through the night, not back toward the ranch, but deeper into the hills, following a narrow, winding trail only Daniel seemed to know. He was taking us to a place called the Sanctuary. It was a hidden cabin, tucked away in a box canyon, used by the settlers' defense network as a fallback point. As we rode, I couldn't stop thinking about my father, my mother. Did she know? Was her grief at the auction just for me? Or was it for the damnation of her husband's soul? The pieces were clicking into place. The sudden financial troubles, my father's desperation, the way he had pushed to sell me, to get any amount of money he could. It wasn't just about shame. It was about survival. A desperate, cowardly survival that cost other people their lives. We reached the sanctuary just before dawn. It was little more than a one-room shack, but it was well stocked with food, water, and ammunition. It felt safe. While Ayana tended to Daniel's wounds, I sat with the little boy we'd rescued. His name was Peter, and his family had been killed 2 nights ago. He was still in shock, barely speaking. I held him, humming a lullaby my mother used to sing to me, and the irony of it was a bitter taste in my mouth. Later, as the children slept, the 3 of us, me, Daniel, and Ayana, sat around a small, smokeless fire. The ledger lay on the ground between us. "This book is our weapon," Daniel said, his voice low. "Marcus Thorne is a respected man in Tucson. He owns half the territory. But this ledger proves he's behind the raids. It proves he hired Caleb Vance to murder his way to the railroad." "And my father helped him," I whispered. The words felt like poison on my tongue. "Your father was a scared man making a bad choice," Daniel said, and his tone was surprisingly gentle. "The real evil is Thorne and Vance." "Vance is my blood," Ayana said, her voice filled with a quiet, burning hatred. "He is my mother's brother's son. He was cast out of our tribe years ago for his cruelty. He walks the white man's path now, but he brings shame to us all. He uses the name of the Apache to do his dirty work, and your people believe it." So, the conspiracy was even deeper than I'd imagined. Vance was using the fear between our peoples as a cover for his greed. He was a monster who belonged to no one. "What do we do now?" I asked. "We can't just ride into Tucson and show this to the sheriff. We don't know who Thorne has in his pocket." "We don't," Daniel agreed. "Patterson mentioned the militia was slow to respond. It's likely Thorne has paid them off too." He looked at me, his gaze intense. "But we have an advantage. They don't know we have this book. They think it was lost in the firefight. They think I'm dead, and that you're just some helpless woman who got carried off." "They're wrong," I said, a new kind of fire starting to burn in my veins. The shame was turning to anger. The anger was turning to resolve. "Yes, they are," Daniel said. A faint smile touched his lips. Thorne's biggest mistake wasn't hiring Caleb Vance. It was underestimating the people he was trying to crush. Just then, a sound from outside made us all freeze. A horse, approaching slowly. Daniel grabbed his rifle, motioning for us to douse the fire. We moved to the cabin's single window, peering out into the pre-dawn gloom. A lone rider was coming up the canyon. As they got closer, my heart stopped. It was my mother. She was alone, riding their old mare, a look of frantic desperation on her face. How had she found us? How did she even know where to look? She reined in her horse 50 feet from the cabin, her eyes scanning the darkness. "Catherine!" she called out, her voice raw with fear. "Catherine, are you here? Please, you have to come home. Your father. Oh God, Catherine, Your father is dead. The world tilted again. Dead? How? Daniel held me back as I started for the door. Wait, he whispered. This could be a trap. But I looked at my mother's face, illuminated by the pale light of the rising sun. The grief there was real. The terror was real. This was no act. I stepped out of the cabin. Ma? She slid off the horse and ran to me, her arms wrapping around me in a desperate, clinging embrace. She was sobbing, her whole body shaking. They came to the house last night, she wept into my shoulder. That man, the one with the scar. He said your father had failed him. He said the plan was ruined because of you and Mr. McKinnon. Caleb Vance. He had gone from the mining camp straight to my family's homestead. He was cleaning up loose ends. He asked where the ledger was, Ma continued, her voice muffled by my dress. Your father, he swore he didn't know. Vance didn't believe him. He... She couldn't finish. She just cried harder. My father, for all his cowardice and betrayal, had died protecting a secret he didn't even fully understand. In the end, he had found a sliver of courage. It was a small, bitter comfort. Ma, how did you find us? I asked, holding her steady. Daniel's network, she said, pulling back to look at me, her eyes red and swollen. After you left. After the auction. I went to see Mrs. Patterson. I couldn't live with the guilt. I told her everything. She told me about the defense network. She told me where the fallback points were. She said if I was ever in real trouble, I should ride for the hills. After Vance left, I ran. So Mrs. Patterson had known all along. She had been part of this. Her husband's suspicion of Daniel must have been a cover, a way to keep their involvement secret. The web of secrets in this valley was deeper and more tangled than I could have ever imagined. Daniel and Ayanna had come out of the cabin now. My mother flinched when she saw Ayanna, her prejudice ingrained and deep. It's all right, Ma, I said firmly. She's with us. We're all on the same side. We brought her inside. She drank some water, her hands shaking. She carried a small bundle with her, which she now unwrapped. It was a half-finished baby blanket. And then I noticed. Her dress was looser. The gentle curve of her belly was gone. The baby, I whispered, my heart aching for her. I lost it, she said, her voice flat and empty. The shock of it all. The doctor in town always said it was a risky thing at my age. She had lost everything. Her husband, her unborn child, her home. All because of a chain of events set in motion by her husband's fear and a rich man's greed. There was no room for anger anymore. Only a profound, aching pity. Catherine, she said, grabbing my hand, her eyes pleading. Vance is going back to the ranch, to Daniel's ranch. He thinks you'll go there. He's taking all his men. He's going to wait for you. He's going to burn it to the ground, just like he did before. It was a trap, a big, obvious trap, and we had to walk right into it. He's expecting me and Catherine to show up alone, Daniel said, his mind already working, piecing together a plan. He doesn't know about Ayanna, and he doesn't know that the rest of our network has been warned. He looked at me. After the attack at the mining camp, I sent riders to every friendly homestead. I told them to gather, not at my ranch, but in the hills overlooking it. They're waiting. This was it. The final battle. It wasn't just going to be me and Daniel against Vance's men. It was going to be the whole valley. What about the ledger? I asked, looking at the book that had cost so many lives. We have to get it to the governor, to someone who isn't on Thorne's payroll. One of my men, the most trusted, is already on his way to Prescott with a letter, Daniel said. He's bypassing the local militia. He's going straight to the top. But it will take him days to get there. We have to survive until then. We have to hold them off. My mother looked at me, her face pale with fear. You can't go, she begged. He'll kill you. I looked at her. at the broken woman she had become. Then I looked at Ayanna, who had lost her family to these same men. I looked at Daniel, who had lived with this grief for 3 long years. And I thought about Peter, the little boy we rescued, asleep in the other room. "I have to go, Ma," I said, my voice filled with a certainty that surprised even me. "I'm not the same girl you sold in Tucson. That girl is gone. They killed her. Now they have to deal with me." The plan was desperate, a long shot, but it was the only one we had. We would let Vance spring his trap. We would let him think he had us cornered at the ranch. And then, when he least expected it, the settlers of the valley would descend from the hills like ghosts. We would trap the trappers. We left my mother at the sanctuary with Peter and Ayanna's brother. She would be safe there. As we rode out, just me, Daniel, and Ayanna, the sun was climbing high in the sky. It was a beautiful, clear Arizona day. A perfect day for a war. I looked over at Daniel. The lines of grief and vengeance were still etched on his face, but there was something else there now. A glimmer of hope. "Ready?" he asked. "I was born ready," I said. And for the first time in my life, I believed it. We approached the ranch from the east, using the creek bed as cover. Just as my mother had said, the place was crawling with Vance's men. At least a dozen of them, positioned around the house and barn, their rifles ready. They were confident. Arrogant. They thought we were walking into our graves. Caleb Vance was on the porch of the house, my house now, sitting in Daniel's rocking chair as if he owned the place. The sun glinted off his golden hair. He looked relaxed, patient, a spider waiting for the fly. "Ayanna," Daniel whispered, "you take the ridge to the north. Don't fire until you hear my signal. Catherine, you're with me. We go in through the cellar entrance at the back of the house. It's the one place they won't be watching." My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs, but my hands were steady on my rifle. All those hours of training, all those tin cans flying off fence posts, it had all led to this moment. We slipped through the tall grass behind the barn, silent as snakes. The cellar door was hidden under a pile of old burlap sacks. Daniel lifted it slowly, revealing a square of perfect blackness. He went first. I followed him down into the cool, dark earth. We were inside, behind enemy lines. We crept up the stone steps that led into the main room. Through a crack in the door, I could see Vance on the porch, laughing with one of his men. The sight of him filled me with a pure, cold rage. Daniel put a hand on my shoulder. He looked me straight in the eyes. "Remember the plan," he mouthed. "No matter what happens." The plan was for me to get to the second floor. From the bedroom window, I would have a clear shot at the men positioned behind the barn. Daniel would stay on the ground floor and deal with anyone who tried to enter the house. Ayanna and the other settlers would open fire from the hills on Daniel's signal, catching them in a brutal crossfire. It was a good plan, but plans have a way of falling apart. I made it to the stairs. I was halfway up when a floorboard creaked under my foot. It was the loudest sound I had ever heard. Down on the porch, the laughter stopped. "What was that?" Vance's voice was sharp. I froze, flattened against the wall, my rifle clutched to my chest. Heavy footsteps crossed the porch. The front door of the house swung open with a loud groan. A man stepped inside, his pistol drawn. He scanned the room, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. He didn't see Daniel, who was pressed into the shadows by the fireplace. But he was going to see me. Any second now, his eyes would drift up the staircase, and it would all be over. I had a choice. I could shoot him and give away our position, starting the fight before our allies were ready. Or I could wait and pray he didn't see me. Before I could decide, Daniel moved. He was a blur of motion, a silent predator. He crossed the room in 2 long strides and brought the butt of his rifle down on the man's head. The man crumpled to the floor without a sound, but the damage was done. "Jed, what do you see?" Vance called from the porch. When no answer came, Vance knew. "It's a trap!" he screamed. "They're in the house!" The world exploded in gunfire. Bullets tore through the thin walls of the house, shattering windows and splintering wood. I scrambled up the rest of the stairs, diving into the bedroom as plaster rained down from the ceiling. The battle had started, and we were at the heart of the storm. I crawled to the window. Outside, Vance's men were taking cover, firing wildly at the house. They were disorganized, panicked. They had expected an easy ambush, not a fortress. I found my target. A man setting up a position behind the water trough. I remembered Daniel's words. Breathe out. Squeeze. Don't pull. I fired. The man spun around and fell. One down. The fight for the valley had begun. Below me, I could hear Daniel shouting, firing, moving from window to window, making himself sound like 5 men. He was magnificent, a righteous fury in human form. Then, from the hills, came the answer. A volley of rifle fire from the north, Ayana. Another from the south, the other settlers. We had them, pinned between the house and the hills, caught in a deadly trap. Vance's men started to fall. They were confused, terrified. They had nowhere to run. I saw Caleb Vance dive off the porch, scrambling for the cover of the barn. He was a coward, just like my father. But a coward with a gun is still dangerous. The fight raged for what felt like an eternity. The air was thick with smoke and the screams of dying men. I just kept loading and firing, my movements mechanical. I wasn't Catherine Wells anymore. I was a soldier defending her home. Finally, the shooting began to taper off. One by one, the last of Vance's men were silenced. A fragile, ringing silence fell over the ranch. It was over. We had won. I stumbled down the stairs. The main room was a wreck, filled with smoke and broken furniture. Daniel was leaning against the wall, reloading his rifle. He had a new cut on his cheek, but he was alive. He gave me a grim, tired smile. "You did good," he said. The settlers started coming down from the hills, their faces streaked with soot, their eyes wide with a mixture of horror and relief. They gathered in the yard, looking at the bodies of the men who had terrorized them for so long. But Caleb Vance was not among them. He was still in the barn. "It's not over," Daniel said, his voice low. "He won't give up." He started for the barn, his rifle held at the ready. "Daniel, no!" I cried. "Don't go in there alone." But he was already gone, consumed by the need for his final revenge. I ran after him. I couldn't let him face that monster alone. I reached the barn just in time to hear a gunshot from inside. My heart stopped. I burst through the doors, my rifle raised. Daniel was on the ground, clutching his leg. Blood was seeping through his fingers. Caleb Vance was standing over him, a smoking pistol in his hand, and a triumphant, ugly sneer on his face. "It ends now, McKinnon," Vance said, leveling his pistol at Daniel's head. "Just like it ended for your wife." He never saw me. He was so focused on Daniel, so lost in his moment of victory, that he forgot all about the woman. I didn't shout. I didn't hesitate. I fired. The bullet hit him square in the back. His eyes went wide with shock. He staggered forward, dropped his pistol, and fell face first into the hay. The silence that followed was absolute. I rushed to Daniel's side. The wound was bad, high on the thigh, but it had gone clean through. He was pale from blood loss, but he was conscious. He looked from me to the body of Caleb Vance, and then back to me. "I told you to stay back," he whispered, his voice weak. "And I told you I wasn't the same girl from Tucson," I said, my hands already working, tearing a strip from my dress to make a tourniquet. He reached up and touched my face, his fingers tracing the line of my jaw. "No," he said, a real smile finally reaching his eyes. "No, you're not." It was truly over. The fighting was done. But the war for the soul of the territory was just beginning. The territorial marshals, sent by the governor, arrived 3 days later. Daniel's rider had made it. They found a valley in mourning, but also a valley that was free. The ledger was all the proof they needed. They rode out for Tucson with warrants for the arrest of Marcus Thorne and half a dozen other prominent citizens, including the local sheriff. The conspiracy was shattered. Justice, real justice, was finally coming to Arizona. Daniel's leg would heal. It would take time, but the doctor said he would walk again. Our neighbors helped us rebuild the house, their gratitude a bond stronger than blood. Ayana and her brother chose to stay in the valley, a bridge between two peoples who had been enemies for too long. My mother stayed with us too. She was quiet, lost in her grief, but slowly, day by day, she was starting to find her way back. She found a purpose in helping to care for Peter, the orphaned boy, and in teaching the other children in the valley how to read and write. A few weeks later, another letter arrived from the governor. It was an invitation. He wanted Daniel and me to come to the capital in Prescott. He wanted to hear our story firsthand. He said our testimony could be crucial in making the case for Arizona's statehood. "I can't go," I said, looking at the fancy official paper. "I can't talk to men like that. I'm just me." Daniel, who was sitting on the porch with his leg propped up, just laughed. "Catherine," he said, his voice warm, "you faced down Caleb Vance. You think a few politicians are going to scare you?" He was right. The fear was gone, replaced by something else, something solid and strong. As we prepared for the journey, Daniel finally told me the last secret. "The $200, he said one evening, as we watched the sun set behind the mountains. It wasn't a random number. He told me that when he had asked for Mary's hand, her father, Marcus Thorne's brother, had demanded a dowry of $200, a fortune at the time. Daniel had worked for 2 years to save it, but when he presented the money, Mary's family had laughed at him. They had their daughter promised to a wealthier man. Mary defied them and ran away with Daniel anyway. They never saw her family again, until her brother Caleb came back with a torch in his hand. "When I saw you on that platform," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion, "and I saw your father so eager to sell you, it felt like I was watching it all over again. A good woman being thrown away by men who couldn't see her worth." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a single worn gold coin. "This was the last of that dowry money," he said. "I kept it all these years, using it to buy your freedom. It felt like I was finally setting things right, for Mary. And for you." He pressed the coin into my hand. I looked down at the piece of gold, and I understood everything. He hadn't bought me. He had redeemed me, and in doing so, he had redeemed himself. The girl who stood on that auction block believed she was worthless. But she was wrong. Her worth wasn't something a man could give her or a father could take away. It was something she had to forge herself, in the fire of fear and the crucible of loss. My journey was far from over. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of the road ahead. Because I knew who I was. And I was priceless. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, so you don't miss the next one.